Hi there! Emily Midget here with you today, sharing my latest installment in the Exploring with Emily series. This month, I'm focusing on the new Hero Hues Reactive Inks as watercolors. Most dye-based inks can be used as watercolors in some basic ways, but the water-reactive properties of the Hero Hues ink make them particularly fun to use as watercolors. For today's project, I've paired the new Sympathy and Friendship stamp from the Colorado Craft Company with Berry Smoothie, Creamsicle, and Grape Slush inks from Hero Arts. I began by stamping this giant rose image onto a panel of Arches cold press watercolor paper using Ink on 3 Fade Out ink. I find that I prefer Ink on 3's Fade Out ink for no-line coloring, both Copic and watercolor, but you can certainly try this technique with any light shade of dye ink that you might have already. After stamping my image on the A2 watercolor paper, I dabbed some of the Berry Smoothie and Creamsicle inks out on my Waffle Flower Crafts water media mat. This mat is perfect for techniques like this. The smooth surface of the mat allows for quick cleanup and provides plenty of space for you to dab your ink pads out. I wanted to do a bicolored rose for today's project. I love the roses that are deep with saturated color at the center and gradually fading to a lovely light shade on the ends of their petals. I also wanted to demonstrate how you can use two seemingly opposite shades of watercolor on the same petal without creating a muddy mess. For each petal, I began by using a fairly concentrated amount of the Berry Smoothie on the section of petal closest to the center of the flower. I then clean my brush and, leaving a fair amount of water on the brush itself, I maneuver that purpley pink into a nice fade, allowing the color to fade to almost nothing. In order to keep the orange in the Creamsicle ink from muddling the purple in the Berry Smoothie into a brown mess, I create something like a barrier by diluting the purple to a very faint shade of lavender, then flipping my cardstock 180 degrees and adding a line of the Creamsicle on the very edges of the petal. I then maneuver with my clean wet brush to dilute the orange into a nice clean mixture of very faint color. You can see that I'm flipping the paper frequently on my slightly elevated board. This is to allow gravity to aid me in creating a natural organic blend. By turning the paper frequently, gravity helps to pull the color out without my having to manually move it with my paintbrush. You'll notice that I frequently dab my brush on my stamp chamois to clean off any excess ink. This allows me to cleanly dilute the color and create that barrier to prevent the two colors from mixing into a mess. Speaking of a mess, no-line coloring requires a bit of strategy to prevent your meticulous watercoloring from becoming a giant blob of messy color. In order to keep your individual petals defined, you want to keep the wet sections separate. Allowing your watercolored section to dry sufficiently before watercoloring the spot directly next to it keeps your lines crisp, maintaining the definition of each individual petal. If I do happen to move too quickly and begin on a section directly next to one that is not completely dry, I try to clean up the resulting feathering by drying my brush on my stamp chamois, then running my brush along the feathered area. The dry brush acts as a sort of vacuum, pulling the unwanted color and moisture up with it. Creating shadows is all about your perspective. That is, the angle at which you are viewing the object in comparison to how the light is hitting it. Usually, when I am coloring something, my mind's eye sees my body as radiating light, so the areas closest to me are lightest, while those further away are shadowed and dark. For this particular flower, the curved tops of the petals are the lightest, so I use a very diluted and pale layer of watercolor to create that subtle color, while the curved and shadowed areas beneath receive more concentrated and vibrant color to help maintain the contrast. Once I have completed the initial layer of berry smoothie and creamsicle, it is time to add some extra shading details and clean up some of the edges. I always like to add plenty of layers of color with watercoloring. I find that it helps to create even further depth and dimension when you have multiple layers of color. For flowers, I generally try to create as much contrast as possible between the shadowed and light areas, because flowers are folded in on themselves and thus have many little crevices that are shadowed from the light. For today's flower, I am adding touches of Grape Slush Hero Hues ink. I have found that purple helps to convey the idea of a shadow on most painted subjects. Depending on how deep I want the shadows to be, I add either very concentrated or very diluted dabs of Grape Slush watercolor to the shadowed areas, usually where one petal is behind another or where one petal is curved over the top of another. By adding this touch of shadow to the spots where the petals curve over the top of each other, you can create extra contrast, conveying depth and shadow, while also helping to clean up the light edges of the petals and make them crisp. When doing detailed work like enhancing the crisp edges of the petals, I try to keep the point of my paintbrush pointed away from me and move slowly in one single stroke. I find that one stroke to be an effective way to maintain a very neat edge, rather than using multiple strokes and creating a somewhat jagged edge. Turning the paper constantly is an easy way to make sure that your paintbrush's point remains crisp. For the foliage, I am using a combination of Key Lime Fizz and Blue Raspberry inks. I wanted to demonstrate that the Hero Hues blend together beautifully as watercolors, just as beautifully as with an ink blending tool. I began by laying down a fairly concentrated line of the Blue Raspberry ink, to which I add a line of concentrated Key Lime Fizz ink. I then clean my brush and use that clean, damp paintbrush to pull the color down into a smooth gradient. The combination of the bright turquoise with the almost neon green creates a very bright and vibrant green, almost too vibrant for such an elegant dusty pink rose, but we will fix that in a minute. After the first foliage layer was complete, I used some grade school knowledge of color mixing to create a muddy greenish-gray shade to add some shadows. I mixed Key Lime Fizz and Blue Raspberry inks with some Grape Slush and added it to the areas that were more shadowed. Because the inks react so well with water, it simply took a quick swipe of color, then some light blending with my clean, damp paintbrush to create some simple shadows and contrast. a little fussy cutting, a pretty plaid background stamp from the stamp market, and a stark black and white sentiment from Essentials by Ellen made for a simple but elegant and utterly summery finished project. Thanks so much for watching my video today. I hope I've inspired you to pull out your Hero Hues Reactive Inks and use them as watercolors. If you liked this video, please be sure to give us a thumbs up, and for more information on the products used, head over to the Ellen Hutson blog. Thanks so much for stopping by, and have a marvelous day.